Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's podcast. Today, I'm going to tell you a story that will concern Mars. Mars has fascinated humanity for a very long time. As a child, I was fascinated by this topic, especially after watching the movie War of the Worlds and then reading H.G. Wells' book of the same name. The book, in my opinion, is much better. It is the first story that describes the invasion of our planet by a technologically advanced civilization. At that time, such stories were considered pure fantasy, although today it is much easier for us to imagine them. But in today's story that I will present to you, it will be different. Instead of an alien invasion of Earth, we will consider the opposite. What if Earthlings colonized Mars? Before we move on to the main story, I will tell you briefly about Mars itself. Mars is the fourth planet from the Sun and is about half the size of Earth. The tilt of its axis is very similar to ours, which is why it also has seasons. A day on Mars lasts almost as long as on Earth, about 25 hours. However, Mars is now a desert planet. How did this happen? Scientists are still trying to explain it. Mars has an atmosphere made up of the same gases as Earth, although in different proportions. For example, it contains much less oxygen, which makes breathing there impossible. But in the story I'm going to tell you, there's a suggestion that it might have been different on Mars. From time to time, various theories and stories about Mars appear on the web. Some claim that governments are hiding certain facts about this planet from us. There are even opinions that government forces operate not only on Earth, but also beyond it. For example, on Mars. And it is in this story that we will talk about the activities of people on Mars. I would like to tell you about a man who claims to have spent 17 years there. This man is Randy Cramer, who claims to have participated in a military mission to Mars, aimed at protecting exploration groups. These groups, according to Cramer, were tasked with exploring the planet, searching for minerals and other resources, and his role was to ensure their safety. Cramer claims that the first landing of humans on Mars was a test mission that took place in the 1960s. However, it was not until 1974-75 that a more serious expedition was organized, which aimed to establish Earth bases on Mars. These bases were to become a place from which humans could conduct further operations on the planet. Cramer also talks about his recruitment into an organization known as the Earth Defense Force, EDF, which he claims was a private consortium with a military character. He claims that private interests are behind the global conflicts that we see on Earth, and the real goal of these activities is trade and profit. EDF was to develop technology that would allow free travel between Earth, Mars, and the Moon. According to Cramer, after being recruited, he first went to bases on the Moon and from there to Mars. This, he says, made sense from a technical perspective, since the Moon is a better starting point for further journeys into the solar system. These operations were to be hidden from the public. Cramer also recalls his childhood, claiming that even as a child he had strange dreams and experiences, which he suggests were a form of contact with alien intelligence. He claims that he was selected out of 300 other people for special projects that were supposedly secret from the public, organized by the government or private corporations. For those interested in learning more about his story, it can be found on the Project Camelot website, where he details his childhood and other aspects of his life. Cramer also mentions the term super soldier, which has been appearing more and more often on the web, suggesting that technology and military advancement have reached a point where individuals like him are trained for special missions. It all comes together to create a story that combines various elements, from Mars exploration to secret military missions to advanced technology hidden from the public. When talking about Randy Cramer and his experiences on Mars, it is worth looking at the further details he provides. After landing on Mars, in a spaceship resembling a flying wing, he learned that there were 5 human colonies on Mars. These colonies, according to him, are well-developed centers, similar to cities, of which 4 are smaller and 1 is the main colony. Cramer says that the technology used in this mission was ambiguous. He did not know whether it was terrestrial technology, alien technology, or even leftovers from research conducted by Nazi Germany during World War II. Cramer referred to the similarities between the vehicle he flew and famous designs from the past, such as the Horton brothers' flying wing that the Germans tested at the end of the war. Another interesting element in his story is the reference to figures he saw in his childhood. He describes them as short, hooded beings who reminded him of characters from Star Wars. This comparison leads to further considerations about how popular culture may have influenced the way people interpret their experiences or dreams of alien contact. Cramer recalls that after reaching Mars, he had contact with a special office where he was given more information about life on Mars. He spoke about the colonies and how Mars was not as empty as most people thought. He gave a number of 5 major colonies that were supposed to exist on the surface of Mars, each ruled by groups assigned to explore and exploit the planet's resources. In addition, he describes incredible details about the infrastructure that had been built on Mars, both for military and civilian purposes. He mentioned massive ships that transported thousands of people and equipment between Earth, the Moon, and Mars, which was supposed to be proof that there was advanced technology that the public was not informed about. It is worth noting that stories like this often mix elements of science, science fiction, and conspiracy theories, making it difficult to clearly assess their credibility. Cramer is not the only one who claims to have been on secret space missions, but his story has gained popularity due to its numerous details and references to popular culture and alternate history. Cramer claims that upon arrival at the horseshoe-shaped zebra base, he was briefed on his mission. His task was to protect exploration teams from the local Martian inhabitants. The base was well organized, with a population of about 1/3 women and 2/3 men. Cramer described daily life on Mars as similar to life at high altitude on Earth. Breathing was more difficult, resembling conditions at about 9,000 feet above sea level, although official science says that there is not enough oxygen on Mars for humans to breathe without the right equipment. Cramer also described the technology used on Mars. The soldiers wore special exoskeletons with micromotors that increased their strength and physical agility. They were comparable to the armor seen in science fiction films such as The Terminator. The soldiers were equipped with advanced weapons, including rifles that operated on the principle of magnetic induction, firing projectiles using magnetic fields. Cramer also mentioned that the ships flying on Mars flew at very low altitudes, about 5 to 6 meters above the surface, to avoid fire from the ground. They were told that this was a way to avoid attacks by the Martian inhabitants. During his stay, Cramer learned that there were 2 races of beings living on Mars. The first, which he described, was reptilian in nature. However, these were not technologically advanced beings, as one might expect, but rather a primitive civilization, using melee weapons such as swords, spears, and axes. It was against this race that defensive operations were to be conducted. Cramer suggested that Mars, although largely unknown and unexplored to the general public, was a place where humanity was conducting advanced colonization operations involving secret organizations working with private corporations. All of this was possible thanks to technologies that allowed for easy transportation between Earth, the Moon, and Mars. Insectoids, as the character called them, lived on Mars alongside the Reptilians. The 2 races were at war with each other, while also attacking human workgroups. The unit Cramer belonged to was tasked with protecting these groups from the threat of both races. The story becomes even more complicated as Cramer begins to discover more about these beings. Over time, he learned that the insectoids were not as primitive as initially portrayed. On the contrary, they had an advanced culture based on spirituality and deep intellect. It turned out that their civilization was once technologically advanced, but after a great catastrophe that destroyed Mars, they decided to reject technology. This catastrophe, as Cramer claimed, was responsible for the destruction visible on the surface of Mars, similar to how our civilization could destroy Earth. The Reptilians, in turn, left the planet after the catastrophe, partially settling other places in space, including Earth. The insectoids that survived hid underground, creating vast tunnels. They decided to reject technology to ensure their survival and avoid a similar catastrophe in the future. This philosophy was crucial to their existence. Although the reptilians and insectoids fought each other, they did not seek the complete destruction of one or the other race. Cramer's forces were tasked with eliminating young reptilians by destroying their eggs before a new generation of warriors could hatch. However, Cramer said it was not about completely destroying the reptilians, because it was believed that if that happened, an even more dangerous race could come to replace them. It was a tactic reminiscent of the methods used by the Americans during the Vietnam War, where there was no clear front line, and operations focused on individual operations and conquering territory. Shortly after Cramer and his team were captured by the insectoids, they began to learn about their civilization from the inside. As it turned out, this race was called the Galuka. Cramer mentioned that he and his companions were tortured and then released, which gradually built trust between them and the Galukas. Over time, a kind of status quo was achieved between the insectoids and the reptilians. A kind of ceasefire was concluded, in which both races agreed not to attack humans or their habitats. These events reminded Cramer of stories from the Wild West, where Native Americans signed treaties with white settlers that were later broken. Despite the agreement between the races on Mars, Cramer suspected that the new arrivals from the Mars Corporation would also break these agreements. Another interesting thread in Cramer's story is the fact that his mission to Mars was part of a larger project codenamed Montana. During his time there, Cramer stumbled upon something that connected Earth and Mars in an unexpected way. According to him, and as supported by Elbulek's claims, the origins of Native Americans were not of this planet. They were actually Martians. Cramer pointed out their distinctive physical traits: shorter stature, broader shoulders, and that unmistakable reddish-brown skin tone, which closely resembled the surface of Mars itself. The planet's high iron content, he believed, was responsible for this striking similarity. This idea wasn't just a wild theory. Cramer referenced ancient Native American legends that alluded to a time when they were not of this Earth. These myths described their ancestors being transported to Earth from somewhere else, possibly Mars. The parallels between these stories and what Cramer had experienced on Mars were too compelling to ignore. Back to Mars, Cramer detailed how during his captivity with the Galuka, a third force became evident: a mysterious, highly technological race that appeared to manipulate the ongoing conflicts between the insectoids, reptilians, and humans. This race operated in the shadows, exploiting the chaos between the various facts. While the reptilians and insectoids clashed and humans struggled to protect their operations, this hidden race was using advanced spacecraft capable of interplanetary travel to observe and intervene discreetly. The military, as Cramer noted, had picked up signs of their presence, but hadn't fully understood their intentions. And then there was the connection to Earth. Cramer claimed that these mysterious beings, whom he later identified as the Ovireptilians, had been known to humanity for a long time. Figures like David Icke and other theorists had mentioned these entities, often describing them as being involved in secret operations on Earth. What Cramer learned on Mars was that these Ovireptilians were the same species that had once lived there, survivors of the catastrophe that decimated the Martian landscape. Some had fled to other worlds, including Earth, where they continued their clandestine activities. But it wasn't just about the grand cosmic drama. Life on the Martian bases had its more mundane aspects too. Cramer described how soldiers like himself would spend years, sometimes decades, on Mars, completely isolated from Earth. They didn't get vacations or time off to return home. Instead, they used advanced technology to simulate leisure activities. He described a device similar to the holodeck from Star Trek, where soldiers could virtually experience things like fishing or walking through the woods, making the long stretches of isolation more bearable. Yet, despite the relative peace that had been established between the humans and the Martian facts, Cramer's mission was far from over. Upon returning from his captivity, he received an order that left him deeply conflicted. His new task was to lead a large-scale operation involving over 1,000 soldiers to infiltrate a sacred temple of the reptilians. The Martian tribes had made it clear that this temple was off-limits. Violating it would be seen as an act of extreme disrespect, if not outright hostility. Cramer knew that this mission would break the fragile peace that had been achieved. It weighed heavily on him as he began to question the morality of his orders. But, like any good soldier, he followed through. When his team entered the temple, the first thing that happened was a sudden loss of communication with the outside. Then, as if the temple itself were alive, strange portals began to open. As the soldiers passed through these mysterious portals, corridors opened up before them. Labyrinths that looked as if they had been taken from stories of secret projects, such as those Preston spoke of in his History of Montauk. From these corridors emerged strange beings, armed with weapons reminiscent of something you would see in a Klingon movie. These were alien technologies that Earth soldiers had no idea about. Cramer described it as a massacre. Inside this temple, which stretched as large as a stadium, 1,000 soldiers fought in close quarters with these undefined beings. No one was prepared for what happened. Despite their advanced weaponry, the Earth forces were completely surprised. Everything happened so quickly, and communication with the command was cut off. Panic reigned as these strange beings passed through the corridors, finishing off the troops one by one. The Earth fleet came to their aid, opening a portal above the temple in an effort to evacuate those who still survived. Only 35 soldiers survived out of the entire 1,000, including Cramer. Those who managed to escape were immediately transported to the hospital, but most of them were seriously injured, both physically and mentally. The rest, those who were not so lucky, died fighting these strange, interdimensional beings. They were creatures that humanity had never encountered before. Their appearance, technology, and way of fighting were completely alien. This is where Cramer's story from Mars ends. After this mission, he returned to Earth, but it was not the end of his service. Cramer continued to serve in the Earth Defense Force, EDF, and fought in other parts of the solar system, such as Titan, Ganymede, and even in Jupiter's orbit. But that is another story, one I do not want to tell now. But before I will finish by touching on an important point that often appears in these types of stories. It is obvious that such a story may seem far-fetched, especially without any evidence. But is it really? What does it really mean that something is made up? On what basis can we assume that such a story has no basis? Cramer, like others who have recounted such events, has not provided any physical evidence to support his story. I know from my experience in the military that soldiers often do stupid things when they have the chance. They make their own videos, take photos, document their activities, and today, with access to technology, it's easier than ever. We know that technology on Mars, that Cramer talked about, was at a very advanced level, which could mean that the devices for recording sound and images were also very developed. So is it possible that there was evidence? It is possible, but Cramer did not provide it, nor did many others who participated in secret military programs such as Montauk. All of these stories share one common thread that is rarely discussed. Namely, many of the people involved in these secret programs were victims of mind experiments, manipulation, creation of memories, generation of realities that never happened. Imagine if someone could implant memories in you that were so real that you were absolutely convinced that you had experienced these events. The memories would be so vivid that you could swear that you had actually experienced them. Cramer mentioned a holodeck where reality was so realistic that it was indistinguishable from real life. So maybe what Cramer experienced was just such an experiment? Such a possibility opens up completely new perspectives for us. Maybe these stories that sound so fantastic are not so unrealistic after all. Maybe they are the result of mind manipulation technology that some forces use to test on us, the citizens of our planet. And that's the end of today's episode of Tales Phony. Thank you for joining us on this extraordinary journey through history, myths, and mysteries. We hope that these stories have inspired you to think and reflect on your own. Remember to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on the next fascinating stories that we prepare for you. If you like this episode, don't forget to let us know in the comments or share with your friends. See you in the next episode, where we will take you on an even more extraordinary journey.